Rachel Reeves says she doesn't agree.
You deny that 3.2 million people are going to be worse off by your welfare changes and that 250,000 people are being pushed into poverty.
I don't think that is what will happen, because I know...
Well, that's what the OBR say.
Well, what the OBR say is they're not, at this stage, making any allowance that people are likely to go into work. But we've put aside £1 billion for personalised, guaranteed training.
Addressing the Commons earlier, Rachel Reeves claimed further forecasts suggest there will be a £9.9 billion surplus in 5 years. But the Office for Budget Responsibility says global economic uncertainty could derail that. And American magazines defended publishing war plans shared on a group chat with a journalist. The Atlantic says it wants people to reach their own conclusions on the texts from the US Defence Secretary. And Nigel Farage has agreed to settle his debanking dispute with NatWest. His account was closed, leading to the resignation of the banking giant's chief executive. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 25 points, 86.89. The pound buys $1.28 and €1.19. LBC weather: rain across western Scotland tonight and Northern Ireland, dry elsewhere and a low of 0. From Global's newsroom, for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
LBC, coming up tomorrow morning on Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
With no spring in her step, the Chancellor laid out another dose of doom and gloom.
The threat facing our continent was transformed when Putin invaded Ukraine. At the same time, the global economy has become more uncertain, bringing insecurity at home. We are reforming our welfare system, making it more sustainable, protecting the most vulnerable, and most importantly, supporting more people back into secure work.
Rachel Reeves set out her plans for the UK economy, but has she made April Fools of householders and businesses alike? Hear all the reaction and hear my interview with the Chancellor as she joins me live tomorrow morning from 7.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player, LBC. This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening and welcome to Wednesday's Cross Question. I'm Iain Dale. It's 3 minutes past 8. Welcome to the show. Now, Richard Fuller is with us. I think you're making your debut on the programme, aren't you, Richard?
I am, yes.
Well, not at all. We're delighted to have you here. He is Conservative Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury and MP for North Bedfordshire. Dame Meg Hillier is Labour MP for Hackney South and Shoreditch, chairs the Treasury Select Committee, was chair of the Public Accounts Committee, so she's got a lot of experience in all matters economic, as has Stephanie Flanders, Head of Economics and Government at Bloomberg, and David Buik, businessman, who is a market commentator for Aquis Exchange. Have I pronounced that right?
Perfect.
Thank God for that. They are here to take your calls on 0345 6060 973, or you can WhatsApp that number, text 84850, and watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Let's go to John in Merton. Hello, John.
Hello there. Yeah.
What would you like to ask?
Yeah, I'm a disabled person, a working disabled person, and I work with a lot of young disabled people in employment. And I'd like to know, because I believe in the social model of disability, has the Chancellor put the cart before the horse in not fixing the systems that support disabled people before hitting disabled people themselves? Shouldn't we be fixing the systems that support disabled people to get into work? Things like access to work, we know, are broken.
OK, thank you very much, John. Meg Hillier.
Well, look, I think you're absolutely right, John, that there needs to be the right support for people to be able to work. And I think we all know that work is a good thing for most people, I've got constituents who want to work more, but for all sorts of reasons can't. Actually, we've got to be careful about making cuts or changes to people's benefits before that support is in place. But only last week I was with some of my job centre, DWP, Department for Work and Pensions, job coaches, and one of them told me a number of heartening stories about people that they've worked with to help them get all of the support they need. But I think you're driving partly at the issue around healthcare support, and I think that is a very big issue. But we are seeing waiting lists go down in the NHS, but we need to make sure that a number of those young people not in work, so 1 in 8 younger people are not in work, a lot of that is because they've got mental health challenges or anxiety or depression. A lot of it, if you look at the graph in the papers that came out today, a lot of it as a result of COVID. And we need to make sure they've got that support to get back into work, because being out of work is the worst thing for everybody, really. So you're right, there's got to be a really important balance that we don't take money out before the support's there, but they can be done together if they're done well. But there's a big challenge to deliver all that needs to be delivered for people.
John is basically saying that the system is broken. Surely the system needs to be mended before you tinker with each individual benefit.
Well, I know from my own local job centre that it's not completely broken. I sometimes regret that rhetoric that politicians use about things are broken in order to... It's a bit macho, isn't it? And I regret that.
Never thought of West Streeting as macho, but there you go.
Well, you know, he wasn't... He's. I mean, people can say these things, but the point is that I know there are great staff in bits of the government that are working, in my case, locally with local partners, and I send constituents there from surgery to say, look, these are really good people who will help you, and often they come back and say, yeah, I've got the right help. So there are bits of it are working well. We need to make sure it's working well for everybody, though, that there isn't a postcode lottery on this. One of the advantages of the Department for Work and Pensions compared with other government departments is that people are all employed pretty much by the government. So you make a change at the top and it does get through very fast. You can make changes quite quickly, and that is some comfort when these, some major changes need to come through. But if you look at the figures of people in employment before COVID and after COVID, it is not yet anywhere near recovered to the level it was before COVID, and that tells us there are some deep problems there that do need to be resolved.
Richard Fuller.
Well, it's heartening to hear John talk about his own life and about what he's trying to do with young people, and also to put his finger of what the changes in Vanessa are trying to do, which is trying to encourage more people into work, making sure when people are in work that they're given the opportunity to be as successful in their career as anybody who perhaps doesn't have a disability. And having been in Parliament long enough, we've been through a number of processes of reform. And I think it was Iain Duncan-Smith originally was the person who said that the goal here is to make people have work, because work is a way out of poverty, work is a way towards dignity. It's good to hear even a Labour chancellor say that today. But John asked about, was it cart before the horse? John, I don't think it's quite that, but there is a sense this has been a bit rushed, that there was an attempt to get this done in time and announced for the budget, so that the numbers could be scored in the budget and then rescored in the budget. Now, I think what Iain Duncan-Smith was saying, certainly what Mel Stride has said privately to me, and I think also today in the Chamber, is to get these changes made correctly takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of thought. And if you rush them, you end up maybe not achieving your objectives, but also sending out a lot of anxiety to a lot of people who may not have been impacted or may not be impacted by these changes. I think that's my concern with what we've heard over the last few weeks.
Well, we had a caller in the last hour, Daniel, who's registered blind, and he was clearly quite traumatised by all of this. And he said that he had been trying to get a job. I mean, he sounded a really intelligent guy. But he said as soon as an employer finds out you're blind, then they say, oh, there's health and safety sort of consequences here, blah, blah, blah. And that, I think, from a blind person's point of view, and we always get a lot of calls from blind people when we're talking about this, they just want to have an opportunity, and it's trying to persuade employers, isn't it? It's not really a government thing in a sense. It's trying to get employers to address these issues properly. Stephanie Flanders.
I think one of the benefits of how the extreme, we've already heard about this, but the extreme change in the numbers joining the kind of health-related benefits queue lines since COVID, there were some very clear reasons for that, one of which was stopping doing the in-person assessments for the PIPs. So it doesn't, just to bring those back is one of the main drivers for some of these reforms, and it's about new claims and down the road, in quite a few years, going back to people who are currently on the roll. So I think there's a lot of concern, people who are currently receiving these payments, worried that it's going to affect them. But a lot of the short-term work is being done, so to speak, the savings is being done by that change, and it can raise a lot of money because so many new people are joining the rolls every week, every day. So I think that just the extent of the problem has given a way to have quite a big change quite quickly without even immediately affecting. I mean, most of the actual changes are not coming through until next year and beyond, without actually affecting people sitting on the rolls now.
I think there is an important point about the rhetoric, though, and I mentioned that earlier, that if people can be frightened if this is put out as simple, cheap headlines. And it really is important that messaging is very clear, and that needs to be, at top level, but also at Job Centre or DWP.
And just to say, relative to the savings, so of course the headline number is just around 5 billion in savings, of which 1.4 is going straight back into these support services. So it's not that they're just sort of putting 40p into those things. And we have in the past found ways of getting people very effectively back into work. So I do think some of this is about turning back on things that were turned off during COVID.
David Buik.
I think my colleagues covered this very lucidly and better than I can, but the most important thing, I think, is time. And I don't think this comes through until 26, 27, which, it's not a long time. But we've got 9,300,000 people in this country economically illiterate or not employed. That's too many. And we have to do something about it.
I think the word's inactive rather than illiterate.
Quite right, sorry. Poor choice.
If they were all illiterate, you could understand it, I suppose.
Poor choice, my apologies. No, but I mean, just to say that I think the time has to be spent, because I think the number of people who ring in are terrified because they think that the government is going for them, and they aren't necessarily. And what has to be done in double quick time is to sort out the wood from the chaff, or the wheat from the corn, or whatever you want to call it, because it's important. There are those people who are desperately in need of help, and there's no way the government's going to withdraw it from them. But we have to work quickly. And I just felt that some of the rhetoric, which Dame Meg said, and I think she's right, comes out as austere and frightening. Whereas if it's explained properly, that people aren't being gunned for, that they're actually, what we're trying to do is to help people who can be helped. And that, I think, is absolutely fine.
And there's one very heartening case I had from a work coach in my constituency just last week. So it wasn't around disability, but someone who hadn't ever worked, from 16, had been on benefits. They met them at 49, and they'd fled a very difficult domestic situation, helped them furnish their flat, and over a period of time helped them get a job. And months later, they came back having had a 10-hour-a-week job, saying, I really love this, I would like more hours, can you help me? Now, that's when it works, it can really work well.
So what, my maths isn't very good, but 33 years of adulthood without work, and suddenly discovers that they quite like it.
Yeah, and because they had that one-to-one support, sometimes it was 5 days a week, sometimes it was a day a week meeting and on their terms, and they coached, encouraged them, and they were there to support them every step of the way.
Let's just take a follow-up question from Lizzie on the Isle of Wight, who says, we were told that it will take long-term decisions and hard yards before we see the economy turn around. Does the panel think the British public will give this government the time it needs to fix our economy? Well, of course, the time it needs is essentially up until the date of the next election, which will either be 2028 or 2029. Stephanie, you've seen over the years sort of different governments impose long-term policies, but probably more likely short-term policies, because we're governed by electoral cycles, aren't we?
Yes, although I think, one of the reasons that Rachel Reeves, and she's had a lot of criticism today, much of it, I think, reasonably well-founded, for leaving herself such little leeway for meeting her fiscal rules. And we may have to revisit again in a few months' time, and politically that's quite damaging. But one of the reasons she's left with very little room for manoeuvre is that the economy has left her with little room for manoeuvre. We have very low growth. That has been something that has been a step change in our situation since the global financial crisis, right back to 2008. And to give some credit to the government, they have a long-term plan which contains long-term measures which actually they're not going to get credit for in the next few years. So, I think there is obviously a concern on the Labour benches that it's not going to come through quick enough, but I did think it was quite striking. It seemed like a very small number, but the Office for Budget Responsibility, the fiscal watchdog, actually raised their, late on in the Parliament, raised their estimate of the potential growth by 0.2. Sounds like nothing, except it's the biggest upgrade in potential that they've had since they've been in existence. They've never seen anything else that a government has done that has even led them to put that much on the growth.
Just completely off the topic, the Office for Budget Responsibility is almost as mythical as the Institute for Fiscal Studies now, isn't it? That we tend to take more notice of them than we do of what the actual Chancellor says.
But we also noticed, I remember thinking this even when George Osborne created it. On the one hand, he was kind of tying his own hands. He was also having someone else take the credit for useless forecasts. And so actually, a lot of this case, we have seen again and again and again, and my colleagues do these charts every time the OBR comes out with things. You can see them systematically year after year revising down their growth and their productivity forecasts. And Rachel Reeves is very lucky that they've done that again, but they have not drawn the lesson that maybe we actually need to be a bit more pessimistic.
I think it's fair enough to say also, and I think Stephanie would agree with me, that the IMF's just as useless. The OECD is just as useless.
Should we just agree that all forecasts
Well, it's a
useless?
mug's game. It's a complete mug's game. And to start coming out with trade forecasts and growth forecasts for 2029, good God, do me a favour. I mean, what I think, there's a lot of good things that Labour have suggested. Infrastructure, the National Wealth Fund, green energy, all these things are positive. Heathrow. Unfortunately, I'll be pushing up daisies before we see any of these growths coming through. What they haven't done, and what Rachel Reeves made a terrible error of judgment, is what the markets felt from day one. If you slag the country off with what she did, which was not the sensible thing to do, that the most important thing is sentiment and confidence. And if you don't instill that from day one and give people the encouragement, give investors the encouragement, give markets the encouragement, particularly the gilt market, you'll take an awful long time to turn around negative sentiment into something positive. And that, I think, has been the big mistake.
The only pushback I'd do on that, you are right that it was a very negative rhetoric. The case against is Liz Truss was really optimistic in her rhetoric. Absolutely. She absolutely had this positive growth vision. She didn't seem to recognise any of the deep-seated problems in the economy, and that freaked the people in the markets out even more if you've got an idea that the government doesn't understand what's wrong with the economy. So it's a tough life being a politician.
Very briefly, if you can, for the politicians. Meg first.
Well, look, I think we've got a comparison of Liz Truss and Rachel Reeves. You couldn't have more different examples. And I think the Truss experience has probably partly led to this very clear, rigid approach to rules. Every chancellor has rules, and they do eventually change over time, though not clearly for quite a while yet under this chancellor. But I think that she's very clearly set out a stall about setting a certainty and stability for the economy in her book. That is making sure that the public finances behave in a certain way and that she will take action if there's a challenge there. And so it's very much leaning into the market. And actually, I think that's been an interesting challenge when it comes to often, every MP, Labour and Conservative, we all come to Parliament with our list of wishes, things we want done, and that's things we want done in our constituencies. There's always going to be that tension about what we want to deliver. But, I agree this thing about long term, it's going to be a long while before a lot of these things come through. So that's quite bold, because most governments, I've often always criticised governments for short-term thinking. I believe in slow politics, decisions made now that will have an impact in 10 or 20 years' time. That's sensible, rather than just chasing tomorrow's headlines. And so that's challenging for her to deliver now.
Well, it's quite slow getting policies out of the opposition, isn't it, Richard?
Well, unfortunately, it's not our job to do policies that affect the economy right now. The opinion of the panel is that Rachel Reeves deserves credit for her long term. I don't share that opinion at all. I think she deserves blame and responsibility for the damage she's causing to the private sector right now. And she's done made the fatal mistake the socialist chancellors always make. They always think that they know better how to spend taxpayers' money than the people do, and they always believe they know better how to create growth than the people who take risks and start businesses and employ people do. That's why she has made the decisions in her first budget to starve the private sector of the cash it needs to grow the economy. And she's written in little pictures in years 28, 29. She has done it deliberately. It was a deliberate decision to raise taxes. It wasn't, she didn't just sort of miss the fact that she took 40 billion in extra taxes, did she? She knew she wanted to do that, and she took that money because she believes that she knows best how to achieve growth in this country. That's a very arrogant position, but I'm afraid that's the position that socialist chancellors always take.
Do you want to respond to that, Meg?
I mean, I think characterising her as a socialist chancellor, I'm not sure she'd quite take that description, but she's a Labour chancellor, and what she's been very clear about, and she's in front of my committee, we're a cross-party committee, our job is to challenge her, but what she's very clear about is that she's trying to focus on the pay packets of ordinary people going out to work, getting a pay slip, and making sure that they have the capacity to make their own decisions because they're protected.
Yeah, but the effect of her policies is there'll be fewer working people.
Fewer working people.
If you're a small business person say, employing a dozen, 15 people, and you have the NIC changes, I mean, you are probably going to have to shed one or two.
Let's be clear, that doesn't kick in until next month. There's been a lot of anxiety about that.
Well, it's next month. We're 3 days off next month.
Well, indeed. But let's see what the outfall of that is. Because remember when the minimum wage was introduced, and the Conservatives at the time in opposition said, "Oh, this will stop jobs being created."
This is very different.
Well, but nevertheless, I mean, next week we're asking her questions as a committee, and we don't take any prisoners.
No, indeed.
On the Treasury Select Committee. Forgive me, Sir Geoffrey Clifton Brown, who now chairs the Public Accounts Committee. But we don't know. But we're there to ask her robust questions, the questions that your listeners would expect us to answer, Chancellor of the Exchequer of the day.
I think on the evening of whatever day you're interviewing Rachel Reeves, you should come back on the programme and report back to us.
On 2nd of April.
I suspect you're going to have some fun with that. Right, we're going to move on in just a moment. It's 21 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:23 on LBC. Richard Fuller, Conservative Shadow Chief Secretary of the Treasury, is with us. He's also MP for North Bedfordshire. Dame Meg Hillier, Labour MP for Hackney South and Shoreditch, who chairs the Treasury Select Committee, as she's just remembered. And Stephanie Flanders, who is Head of Economics and Government at Bloomberg. You may remember her for many years on the BBC. And David Buik, businessman who is a markets commentator for Aquis Exchange. It should be Aquis, shouldn't it? Really?
No, it's Aquis.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's a French word. Right, let's take a question from Wesley in Gravesend. One of the criticisms Labour used to face was that they just took from the taxpayer to give to those who don't contribute. Isn't this new government right in trying to ensure the taxpayer is not overstretched? After all, no one wants to pay more tax. Well, we've got the highest tax burden ever at the moment. David?
Well, we have. I mean, there's no question of any doubt about it. What I think people need to hear and want to do is what is the fairest way of taxing people? And it's a very easy, trite comment to come out with something. It's just that I'm so in Richard's camp in saying that national insurance contribution for employers was the death knell for growth for the next 6 months. I'm not saying it for longer than that, but I think it will disturb sentiment significantly. And it's just that the government needs to learn that you need to take risks. It's one of the conversations I had with Andy Haldane about a month ago. What he feels at the moment is the government and the country is totally risk averse. And until you actually give them the incentive to actually do something, it's not going to change at all. Like, we've got to stop stamp duty on share trading. We've got to give serious capital gains tax relief to small businesses to make sure that they are up and running, gung-ho, fixed banners and over the top. And it's unbelievably important. I think people are actually, I mean, one of the things, I don't know whether people agree with me, if on whenever it was, the 30th of October, that Chancellor Reeves had come up and said, right, 1p on income tax, I think they'd have swallowed it. because I don't know what it actually would have raised, but I think as something that we could probably all cope with. What we can't cope with, in my humble opinion, is any kind of taxation which actually makes people lay their tools down.
Stephanie?
I mean, I guess I sympathise with. I certainly don't think it was a very, very good tax to raise, but we have sort of forgotten that it was sort of 12 months ago, give or take, that Jeremy Hunt, as Chancellor, introduced the second of two national insurance cuts, which realistically the UK couldn't afford and would have been reversed in some way by a future Conservative government. If you look at the numbers, they were paid for by taking 20 billion out of spending department budgets that was definitely going to go back in after the election in some shape or form. So I think the lack of risk-taking was actually the Labour, the incoming, or the then opposition, not saying, you know what, we're going to stand by our commitment, we're not going to raise taxes on working people, but we're going to keep them the same as they were last year, but we don't think this is affordable, and we're going to reverse this one that you've not even noticed that Jeremy Hunt has done. And that would have been on individuals rather than employers, and you wouldn't have had this upfront. I think, as an economist, you don't see that much difference between the two, but I totally accept that businesses feel it much more directly when when you have that increase on the national insurance contribution on employers, and they did that because they'd made this rather silly promise. Yep. But I think the original sin, to some extent, on that particular one, or at least half of the original sin, was an unsustainable tax cut, which was supposed to be a trap for Labour, was a pure political ploy.
I mean, Meg, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because any government, particularly a government with a massive majority, it is never as strong as it is the day after the election. And effectively, and I think Tony Blair has said that he regrets when he was first elected not being more radical. Frankly, Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves could have done anything in that first budget and we would have all probably swallowed it. Even I think even Conservatives would have found it quite difficult to argue against what Stephanie has just said. We'll find out in a moment.
Well, I'm
sure we will.
Yeah, the dog that didn't bark in the election was tax. We haven't had a proper discussion about tax in this country, and every time either of the main parties said something about tax, the other party said they'd do the same thing. Or no, everyone was frightened that there'll be the Facebook ads and the TikToks going out saying whichever, the Conservative tax bombshell from whichever party, I think Stephanie's right in a way. It was a trap by Jeremy Hunt as the former Chancellor to set this and see if Labour would back it. But there was a real fear because Labour, has always, one of the things that Rachel Reeves has really been trying to do is to say Labour is safe with your money is safe. We're not going to be a reckless government overspending. There's no magic money tree, and I think that we perhaps you can swing too far one way or another. I think though. So we'd boxed ourselves in, so there weren't very many options on tax rises. But I remember meeting the civil servant in the Treasury who had set up the unit in the Treasury. There's always a little unit in the Treasury doing something interesting, and they'd been tasked with finding taxes they could raise that weren't income tax. And they had a party when they reached their first £1 billion. Well, I think they're well over that by now. And we are getting taxed all over the place, and we've been under different governments, but people don't see it.
When was this that you met this civil servant?
It was quite a few years ago.
Oh, I was thinking it was after the election.
No. I mean, this is.
I thought we got a story there.
No. But my point is that this was under. I think it was actually under a Conservative government. It was established. I mean, but it doesn't really matter which government. That every Chancellor over many years has tried to find ways of raising tax without hitting people in the pocket with income tax, and that's a noble aim, not to hit people in the pocket with income tax. But you've got to look at the impacts of other taxes. So, you mentioned stamp duty on houses, on shares. There's lots of discussions, and it's very difficult to have discussions about tax in a really open way because people get very jumped up about it, and quite rightly, because it's hard-earned money by our constituents, and we need to be spending it very carefully.
Richard Fuller.
Just to start a little bit about growth, we talked a lot about numbers, but I was just thinking as we were talking, my impression of the period when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister and Tony Blair was that when they talked about growing the economy, they recognised that it was the people out there who were going to make growth happen. It wasn't going to be a matter of government. Government could do a certain amount to enable it, but mostly the lion's share of the work was going to have to be done by encouraging, incentivising people to say, you know what, I think I'm going to go out and become a plumber because I think they make a lot of money. Or I'm going to hire this extra person. I haven't done it for 10 years, but I think now it's time to make that step. I think that was sort of why the UK was growing well. But, to the point I was saying about growth rates really in the last 2 decades, I think across all Western democracies, growth is much lower. And politicians have been slow to realise that. They have been trying to say we'll achieve growth. And in doing so, they have increased the debt of this country by endeavours that have not worked. They've increased taxes, which have reduced the capacity of people to go out and invest. And we're now in a situation, for all good, I'm not blaming anyone over all those periods, really, but I would blame us if we didn't now look at the issue with such a large amount of debt, with very high and increasing charges on that debt that have to be taken out each year from public spending, with an ageing population that we want to provide dignity to, either through the state pension or through the care they may need, and with the impending requirement for us to increase spending on defence. When we talk about nudging money around here, there and everywhere, even today, I just get the sense that we're sort of pushing the big decisions down the road once again. And come June, maybe, with the multi-year spending review, this is a golden opportunity for my counterpart, Darren Jones, the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, really to get to grips with that, because with COVID and before that, Brexit and before that, the great financial recession and that, we've never had the chance of relatively, goodness knows what's going to happen, but this is an opportunity. So I think the biggest risk for your listeners is that politicians don't realise the scale of the challenge and confront the public with the hard choices that's going to mean about things the state can do on their behalf.
You're nodding there, Meg.
Well, a year ago, I wrote a list of what I called the big nasties, and that was only some of the things, because I would only put in that list things that could bottom out completely financially, things that sometimes have been left over many governments, some over the last 14 years. We have never decommissioned a single nuclear submarine in this country. I checked with the minister the other day, and apparently one is nearly done now, but that's since we've actually had them in service. There's big issues at the Animal Health Centre in Weybridge. If we had some serious zoonotic diseases, more than one, we would struggle to cope. We wouldn't be able to cope with that. Porton Down needs investment. These are risks. These are some of them bigger tickets than others in terms of money, but not doing them has left big risk to the country.
You're not cheering us up.
Well, and these are big challenges that I put them out there, partly because I thought, whatever happens at the election, it's important to say, after nearly a decade chairing the committee I was chairing, that I sort of highlight some of these big, risky challenges that are going to be very costly to fix.
Can I just share a story? Because Meg, as you were saying, was chair of the Public Accounts Committee, and this is the committee that looks at, retrospectively, has taxpayers' money been spent wisely? And I resisted going on it because I didn't want my blood to boil. Until just before the general election, I went on for one meeting, and I've known Meg for a long time, and I think Meg is one of the best parliamentarians we have, really concerned about her constituents, really cares about the country. And we go back 10, 15 years. So I really respected it. I said, Meg, I promise you, I've just come to listen. I'm not going to say a word.
Yeah, right. And you're a politician, Richard.
And it was Porton Down and another paper. Basically, the paperwork said 2017, a decision was made to make this change. It was going to take 7 years, and it was going to cost £400 million. That was 2017. We're now in 2024. And nothing's happened, and all £400 million has been spent. And I sat there, tight-lipped in, until I heard the two representatives use the phrase, when it comes to misuse of public money, I hate. Lessons have been learned. Because where I come from, in the private sector, if you make such a mistake, you're fired. There's accountability. And I think across the public sector, one of the things that, again, will be interesting with this new government, because there is opportunity. What can we do to improve that sense of accountability so that we know we aren't just leaving it to Meg and her old committee and now Geoffrey Clinton-Brown, but there are eyes across the public sector looking at every piece of money we take, every pound we take off our taxpayers, to say we actually are using it as wisely as we can.
Can I
You don't want to mess with Porton Down, though, Richard, if I were you.
Oh, heavens, no.
Goodness me. We have to go to the news, I'm afraid, David, if that's OK. It's 8:34 on LBC. The news headlines with Daryl Jackson.
The Chancellor has exclusively told LBC she doesn't believe 250,000 people will be pushed into poverty by her welfare cuts. Rachel Reeves has been speaking to Iain Dale after announcing plans to halve health payments on universal credit before freezing them. The French President Emmanuel Macron said a proposed European armed force in Ukraine under a potential peace deal could respond if Russia launched an attack. He's spoken after talks with Ukraine's president ahead of a summit of 30 nations in Paris tomorrow. And 2 men have been arrested after a pedestrian died after being hit by a car that was driving away from police in northwest London yesterday. Officers say the hit and run happened in Edgware yesterday afternoon. LBC weather: rain across western Scotland tonight and Northern Ireland, dry elsewhere and a low of 0.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:37, Richard Fuller from the Conservatives, Dame Meg Hillier from Labour, Stephanie Flanders from Bloomberg and David Buik from Aquis Exchange are with us answering your questions. And the next one is from Henry in Cardiff. Hello, Henry.
Hello. Good evening, panel and fellow listeners. My question is this. Do you think the setting of interest rates should be removed from the Bank of England and returned to the government?
Did you phone in the other day and say that?
I did, but I didn't get a response, unfortunately. My name didn't come out of the hat.
Oh, well, no, it's just because I remember talking to someone about this. It seems to become a subject now that the Bank of England is being blamed for a lot of things. Richard Fuller, do you think that it should go back to the Treasury?
I think it's hard to do that. Most developed economies have an independent bank. It does mean it does have an effect. We talked a bit earlier on about the Office for Public Budget Responsibility and taking decisions away from democratic elected politicians. But I think it would be very difficult to reverse that decision made by Gordon Brown.
Meg.
No, I think it should stay with the Bank of England. And actually, I have the privilege of meeting the Monetary Policy Committee on a regular basis. And they're independent. They have independent economists who come and sit on it, and they have different views, which they're openly able to air in front of the committee and indeed in public. And they have a really good discussion, and they can challenge each other and make different decisions, and their vote is public. I think it's a very transparent thing, and I just see how they work and the methodologies that they use and how they've been recently trying to modernise the way they make the decisions, and I think it's very robust. And I think the danger is, we've seen that we had a turmoil over the last decade in politics. I think actually having a steady, properly well-versed group of people with a very clear public remit is really important.
Stephanie, have you never been asked to go on the Monetary Policy Committee?
I would never comment. I think the reason, I have to say, I'm not surprised that you're obviously you've got the makings of a grassroots campaign here. You're getting all these calls.
Yeah,
there is actually a reason. There's a genuine reason, I think, why people are questioning it. If you think of the time in which they've been independent, basically, since Gordon Brown, since 1997, most of the things that they've had to do, most of the crises they've had to respond to since then have involved cutting interest rates, making mortgages look cheaper. The difference in the last few years was that you had an inflationary shock, which had actually put up people's bills, so they're already suffering. And instead of the Bank of England coming in and helping them, which they normally do when they're suffering, in their recent memory, they've had to actually make it worse by increasing their mortgage rates as well, because they've had to tackle this increase. So I think there is actually a structural reason why, central banks, they would never say they'd had it easy until the COVID shock, but that inflation and probably we're in a world where it's going to be slightly higher inflation, just sort of generally, and higher interest rates generally than there have been, is going to, mean that they are more and more unpopular, and potentially more and more people will be calling you.
David?
I think I'm basically for keeping it, but I think what is very important is how powerful the governor of the Bank of England is at that time. And in the case of Mervyn King, we always had somebody who knew exactly where he stood. Exactly. Mark Carney, for me, made too many mistakes. I didn't like the way that he didn't deal with quantitative easing when he should, and various other things. I thought he was, frankly, without being disrespectful, pretty poor.
You better go over to Canada and warn the Canadians before they...
done it already, as I I think Andrew Bailey's grown into the job. I think a lot of people were quite sceptical to start with. I think he's done a very good job. And I think, when you consider what's happened since 2008, from the financial crisis when the banks just blew up, and as Stephanie alluded to, I don't think we've ever recovered from it completely. And then COVID, £400 billion spent keeping people in work and other things, and with all the other abuses that went with it. And then, of course, the inflation going to 11%. I mean, these were really serious challenges. And I think the quality of the MPC committee has been very, very high.
Well, I've only ever known two members of that, Danny Blanchflower and Ian McCafferty. And Ian McCafferty used to come on my programme and he would do an hour with me taking calls from listeners. And he just had this wonderful knack of being able to explain really complicated economic problems in a way that even I could understand with my grade E economics A level. And I thought, well, if I could understand it, the listeners can understand it. I was going to say, this lady that I'm sitting next to is the best explainer of a complicated financial issue I have ever heard. Well, maybe we should have you in. Maybe we should have you in for an hour taking calls from listeners, Stephanie. What do we make, just before we go to a break, what do we make of the fact that inflation has come down again today after having gone up the previous month? The outlook for inflation doesn't look particularly brilliant over the next 12 months. I think they're projecting it to go up sort of somewhere between 3 and 4% on average. What effect will that have on the economy? And interest rates.
Well, I think this bit of good news, I think, means that we can have at least a couple more interest rate cuts. But I think if you look at the world, the inflation's been jumping around over the last few years. Has often been driven by energy costs and food prices. If you look at all the uncertainties, there's been a lot of talk about that today. We're in a world of Donald Trump, of possible tariffs, of all these things, wars. All of those things tend to put up the prices of things that people really rely on, whether it's and climate change as well. You have more often crop failures and disasters. You've got tariffs putting up the price of things. So I think we're looking at probably higher inflation than we've been used to over time, but it also just jumping around a lot more.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
Well, what is interesting, when we've talked to the Bank of England and and the MPC, they are very clear. They see a trajectory down on interest rates. They're very confident that there's a steady, so that they may not have dropped at the last meeting, but it hasn't been going up, and they're very confident about that. But I think, Stephanie's absolutely right. Energy prices, food prices, and all those uncertainties, that's what's driving inflation. And so they are hard things to resolve quickly. The war in Ukraine, all the challenges we know about the food supply chain make it difficult to change that very quickly.
Can I just nip in very quickly? I think the other thing that was transformed the MPC and the Bank of England and interest rates was when Andy Haldane was appointed chief economist, because he was the first person I know at a very senior level who went round the country everywhere, finding out what people felt, what they needed, what they really expected from government and the rest of it. And he was the person who came back and collated all that information and used the rest of the Bank of England and the MPC to come to what I thought was pretty sensible decisions on a number of occasions.
Pauline has some fan mail for you, David.
Good God.
She says, love your show, Iain. Wonderful to hear David Buik. He's a brilliant economist who explains in plain English to the ordinary man in the street can easily understand.
I'm not an economist, but how very kind of her.
Well, just take the praise.
I will say that.
It doesn't come through very often on that screen that Stephanie is fascinated by. It's 8:45 on LBC.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:48. Richard Fuller is here. He doesn't have a podcast yet, but Meg Hillier, you do.
Indeed. Well, not me personally, but I, as well as chairing the Treasury Select Committee, I chair the Committee Corridor, the Liaison Committee, and we have a podcast called Committee Corridor. And there are back episodes.
Sexy title.
Well, it is what it says on the but it's demonstrating, hopefully, to listeners what we're doing on their behalf. And very often it's because they've suggested things that committees look at things as well. So the new series is about to launch, and we've got 4 previous series from previous parliaments, which are definitely well worth going and listening back
Watch those listener numbers shoot up.
Well, we were in the top 5 podcasts in the country when we first launched. So living in hopes.
It's amazing what statistics can do, isn't it? Stephanie, you have a podcast?
I do, Trumponomics, which also does what it says in the tin, although I'm a bit sad because it used to be called Stephanomics, so obviously I feel like it's a bit of a step down. But it's still presented by me, it's not presented by Donald Trump. But it's not just about what Trump's doing, it's kind of how... and there's quite a lot about the US, but it's also about how Trump's economic policies are affecting the whole world, which obviously we do talk about.
And David, is your podcast finished?
No. Finished here. But right. I do a podcast with Michael Wilson, who used to be business editor at Sky, called Talking Markets.
Good. I'm glad we've cleared that, because somebody texted in earlier to say, why is his podcast finished? But it hasn't.
It's terminated here.
Terminated. Oh, okay. Sorry, I don't mean to intrude on private grief. No. Text question from Bob in Newbury, who says, why are so many MPs now making clear that they want to resist the will of the people on the most difficult of issues and deny us the right to a dignified end to our lives? Now, Labour MPs, including Meg, have written a letter to their parliamentary colleagues which argues that the assisted dying bill is irredeemably flawed and not fit to become law after the scrutiny process of it came to an end yesterday. The bill's sponsor, Labour MP Kim Leadbeater, insists that the scrutiny process has made already the strongest assisted dying legislation anywhere in the world even safer and more robust. Well, Meg, you clearly disagree with that.
Well, indeed, and I think that this is a fundamental shift if the state is sanctioned to take life. It would actually also mean complete rewriting of the foundations of the NHS and the principles on which that's built in order to allow it to happen. The sponsor of the bill said that the High Court judge overseeing it was one of the strongest protections in the world, and that's why it was a bill that should be passed at second reading. Many colleagues took that and agreed with that, and that's now been replaced with a commissioner for assisted dying, a death czar, if you like. And, well, I mean, that would have to be appointed by the Prime Minister and a panel of a doctor and psychiatrist and other professionals who would make the judgment. But that's taking out the legal process. It might include a retired judge, but that's a slightly different thing. But one of the really big concerns I have is about protections for people. I represent a lot of people from a wide range of backgrounds, but a lot of people who are quite vulnerable, who I think we really will fear would be coerced into doing this because it would be convenient for other family members. And I've been around the block a lot, 31 years now as an elected politician, seen that families aren't all as loving as you would hope they would be, and that there are lots of reasons why people might want to hasten someone's end. And also I've had steeped in palliative care for nearly 50 years, seen what really good palliative care can do to support someone. So I absolutely believe in dignity in dying, and I believe that's best done through palliative care. And we cross a Rubicon when we allow the state to take life, and once we've crossed that, we're in a very different place.
Richard Fuller.
I agree completely with Meg. Many years ago, when we had the first discussion, I think it was about 8-10 years ago in Parliament about this, I thought it was important we do discuss it in Parliament. And that time it fell before second reading, or at second reading. This time we've taken it to the committee stage, but there have been a series of rollbacks on what was asserted initially, and this is a difficult circumstance, and obviously the person who wrote in asked about his rights. Politicians have to think about that in all circumstances, so not always good people in good circumstances with very desperate situations that quite obviously anyone with a heart will want to see resolved as carefully and with great consideration as they can. But that is not what changing the law is about. It is about looking at those issues where it could be misused, misinterpreted, pressure applied, and for the reasons that Meg, I think, has outlined, a number of people who, at second reading, felt they wanted to take it to the next stage will, when it comes back, decide that they can't support it to be changed into law.
David.
Not qualified to speak. I think that our two MPs have been incredibly articulate and given very good reasons why they're against it.
What's your gut on this?
I'll be off to Switzerland.
Well, not now, I hope.
No, but if a push comes to a shove, I'm for it.
And so what they've said makes you sort of maybe revise that opinion?
Might do. I just think they were unbelievably articulate and gave very good reasons. But before hearing what they had to say, because I don't go through the process of reading all the stuff that goes through Parliament and what people have looked at and what they've investigated and the rest of it. And just out of somebody being utterly miserable and being unable to cope with life at all, that if their family think it's right that they should go to Switzerland or wherever it is, I think they should be allowed to, that's all.
If their family think it's right for them to go, I mean, surely it's got to be up to them. You can't have the family making the decision.
Come on, let's be practical. There's a big conversation.
No, but that actually plays into exactly what Meg and Richard have just said.
Yeah, but you're not going to stand up as somebody who's got cancer, who's got 3 months to live or whatever it is, and say, I'm off without discussing it with your family, surely.
Stephanie?
In many ways I'm not qualified, but I would say that in the time that the bill was introduced in the autumn, just happened to be a time where a very close family member of an old friend who had lived in Spain for many years chose an assisted death. She had fatal brain cancer, and it was very striking to me. Many MPs were raising quite reasonable doubts about whether a private member's bill was really the right vehicle for this discussion to be had, and would it allow enough time for the nation to be thinking more seriously about the nature of death. And I was very struck that it just felt like this was a very established passed without comment in Spain, very established part of their system that people could choose this. But it went with, I would say, a very grown-up, rather different approach to dying and death in general in Spain. And I sort of felt like we weren't quite there yet, and I kind of ended up sharing the view, even though I'm sympathetic to it, enormously sympathetic to people being able to have assisted death, we need a proper conversation about it. And I think also we need a bill, I think, that's ultimately a government bill, not an individual private member's bill.
OK, I'm going to take two questions in one here, but we haven't actually got a long time, so I'm going to ask you to be reasonably concise. The first one is from Imran in Reading, who says, West Streeting has said that Israel's ongoing assault on Gaza is unjustifiable and intolerable. If this is the UK government's position, which it should have been 12 months ago, then when will we sanction Israel and stop all arms licences? And Lottie in Canterbury says, how much weight can we put into the chants heard in Gaza last night of Hamas out? Hundreds of people took part in large anti-Hamas protests in Gaza last night, and I think over the previous few nights as well. But masked militants, some of them armed, broke up the demonstrations. So, two questions in one here. Richard, let's start with you.
Wow, and to be brief...
I'm sorry.
I'm not an expert in this area, and I don't want to wade in on it. If you go back to the original situation with the attack on October 7th, and then you can understand why a state would want to get the hostages back and bring the people to justice. The strategy that Israel, and I fully support that, but the strategy that Israel undertook, I don't think was the right strategy to achieve those goals. I think it's had a lot of additional consequences which will be difficult for Israelis of future generations to deal with, and for Palestinians of future generations to deal with, but will have a material effect on the impact and the influence that our own country, in particular America, has in the Gulf and in the Middle East more generally. And although we can criticize America for lots of reasons, and we should, they can also in many instances be the force for good, the one country that can bring lots of people with very, very different views together behind a strategy. I'm not saying American strategy is right, but I think that where we are, the question was about Hamas and being a chance and being disrupted. One could only hope that there are forces in Palestine and in Israel that believe that there is a future, that they can cohabit to each other in the future.
Meg?
No, I think the situation has gone, to such... It is, as West Streeting is absolutely right, unjustified and intolerable. When the hostages were first taken, of course, it's right that any nation would defend itself. But what Netanyahu has done is take his country into this situation and killed thousands and thousands of people in Gaza. On the other hand, they've still got hostages there. But I think what has happened has put back the cause of a two-state solution a very long way. I still believe and want to see that, because ordinary people in Gaza and Israel just want to live a peaceful life. And the political situations in both countries make it very difficult to have that diplomatic approach. But in terms of arms licences, there's been changes. It's a delicate balance at the beginning, but later on, David Lammy has been very clear on arms licences about removing most of those, and that we've got to be very cognizant of what weapons are being used for. But and as an ally, have been an ally of Israel, we need to be very honest with them about our views, which I think government ministers are being.
Stephanie?
I think it's testing the Israel's position, and particularly the suspension of aid in response to the ongoing negotiations around the ceasefire. I think is testing an already very difficult line. But I would say this is not going to be the only time where, again, President Trump's willingness to break international norms, support governments that are willing to cross a lot of lines, is going to put the UK in a very difficult position.
David?
Agree with what Stephanie is saying completely. As far as I'm personally concerned, a bridge too far. October the 7th, I buy that. The reaction, I buy that. And the hostility that broke out, absolutely fine. But when you start getting to 40,000 plus deaths, that's too much.
Indeed.
Right, slightly awkwardly now, we'll change gear to our fun question. It's from Ben in Rochester, who says, in my opinion, David Buik has one of those David Attenborough voices. You're getting all the praise tonight, David. One of those David Attenborough voices which I could listen to for hours. Well, you can do on this podcast. Whose voices could your panel listen to for hours? Well, let's start with you, David.
Terry Wogan. because he's decent, and kind, and makes you feel good. And he was always had a wonderful attitude to absolutely everybody.
And there's something about Irish accents as well, isn't there?
I think there is. It's very welcoming.
Stephanie?
I mean, Attenborough's a good shout, but I think, Charlotte Green, I think we still, we miss her dulcet tones.
Yeah.
She
did the football for a while, didn't she?
She did.
Yeah.
Meg?
Oh, I mean, I fangirl Floella Benjamin, or Baroness Benjamin,
really?
as she is now. Well, I was one of her play school babies. So in the days for younger listeners, when there were 3 TV channels and you had them scheduled and you couldn't watch them on catch up, I loved play school and I loved Floella Benjamin. And when I now meet her in the House of Lords, it's just, I can close my eyes and listen to her forever.
Can I just tell you who I interviewed on Sunday morning at LBC? Peter Purvis.
Oh, you'll get me started on Blue Peter. Oh, my word.
I know, I was so honoured.
But this is dating us, isn't it? That we can remember
but the fact is, all of us remember Peter Purvis. Richard?
Forgive me, I don't immediately remember his name. Who's the actor who plays Paddington Bear?
Oh, Ben Whishaw.
Him.
Oh, is he? I thought it was Hugh Bonneville.
No,
he's in it. Yeah, right.
Him as Paddington Bear, I just think that voice is so melodious, so lovely. But not him as the brutal killer and assassin and something else he did.
He was brilliant in that, though.
He was brilliant in that. His voice as Paddington Bear.
Well, I'm going to vote for Mary Jane Cullen from Radio Broadland when I was at university. Oh. And I wonder how many people listening will think, oh, I remember her, because she just had this voice that was just right for late night radio, and in the mid-1980s there weren't many female voices on late night radio. Thank you all very much indeed for coming in this evening. On Monday, the Daily Express political journalist Christian Calgi will be with us, Labour activist Jovan Owasuna-Paul, who took on Nigel Farage in Clacton last year, former Tory minister Mark Field, who's got a book out which I'm about to read, plus we'll have a minister on from the Labour government. They promise us anyway. Now, in the next hour, we're going to return to the subject of the spring statement, and we're going to ask you this question: is Rachel Reeves the woman to steer the economy into the sunlit uplands? Because essentially, if she doesn't, there could be an interesting situation at the next election, because if Labour don't deliver on the promises that they made at the last election on growth, on all sorts of other things, and if the Tories continue to sort of tear themselves apart, maybe have another 2 leaders before then, there's only one person that's going to benefit from that, well, possibly 2, Nigel Farage and possibly Ed Davey. And that's the responsibility, I think, that the Labour government has got. People would say to save the country from Nigel Farage. I'm not saying that. Other people would say that, obviously. 0345 6060 973.
On Global Player and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the Chancellor's exclusively told LBC she rejects claims that £3.4 billion in